All right, so I'm super excited to have Carlo here with us today. Carlo is, I would say, a bit of a unicorn in his professional experience. I think it's very, very rare to have someone who has been boots on the ground in the startup world, where it's like, man, get clients, cash flow, building something from the ground up, and then also the perspective of Fortune 500. Big scale consulting. So Carlo's going to introduce himself, but from a background from PwC, BCG, Manifold Group, to the startup world, his experience is an incredibly unique one. And so I'm excited to have him here with us because my world is the startup world, bootstrapping to Series A and growing. So my thought is, what can we learn from that dual perspective? So with that, I'm excited for Carlo to kind of walk us through a couple different frameworks today.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. And I would say I'm more of a bulldog than a unicorn.
Okay.
My career has been, I've been doing many different things. I started off working for a small company as an operator, as a general manager. It was a small business unit, pretty much felt like a startup, but it was within a large corporation called Cemex in Mexico. I was in the retail division. So I started off doing that, and then I came to Chicago for business school. I went into big consulting with PwC and BCG, and then I went back to small business after that. I missed the thrill of the operations and being on the hook for results. So I went back and worked for a boutique venture and software development company here in Chicago called Manifold Group. So that's where I met Luke. So the thing with me is I went, like I said, went to big consulting and learned all these frameworks and playbooks and learned a lot of good things beyond that. And then when I went to Manifold, I did all this work for a startup company, and it got me thinking. It got me reflecting about what is it that I have learned from consulting, from big consulting, that I can apply at Manifold, if anything, right? And I was able to figure out, beyond all the good things in terms of ways of working and just dealing with relationships and client service, beyond all of that, there were a few things I learned from the BCG playbooks that I think are applicable for smaller companies, specifically for early stage startups. And that's what I want to share with you today. So anyways, we'll talk about it in a minute, but I'll let Luke introduce himself.
Yeah, and if you're on this LinkedIn Live, you probably know me. I'm a 4-time founder. I've exited a B2B software company that I was the owner in for about 8 years. Also had a direct-to-consumer e-commerce brand, and right now I lead and have founded Serendipity, which is a B2B growth agency. So we only work with B2B companies, helping do sales and marketing. Also, father of 3 very high energy boys. Just had our 3rd one 5 weeks ago, so I'm a little fresh off of that. But yeah, you guys know me.
Thanks, Luke. So let's get into it. So what can early stage startups learn from Fortune 500 strategy playbooks is the name of the conversation today. Like I said, went to BCG, and then after that joined Manifold. I was thinking, well, what is it that I learned that I can apply, if anything? And the reality is, from the playbook standpoint, there are not a lot of things that are applicable to Fortune 500s that work for startups. In fact, I had a professor at business school, Jim Schrager, who teaches new venture strategy. He would say, look, completely different things. The frameworks that you use for venture capital, early stage startups are different from the playbooks that you use for corporate strategy. Now, when you're in a Fortune 500, yes, you might have things that are analogs to new ventures, such as a new product or just starting a new business, or even acquiring, a small company through a corporate venture. But for that, you use the new venture playbooks, not the Fortune 500 playbooks, which is the topic of today. So what is it then that we can learn? Right? And I reflected a lot on this, and there was one model and one framework that I think is very applicable. And I've used it many times at BCG, but also I used it within Manifold. I'm going to get into it, and I'm going to start very high level, so please bear with me. And then I'll get much more practical and specific, and we'll talk about a couple of cases of what is it that I mean. So there's this mantra. This is basically the model that I'm going to talk about today: people, process, and tools. It's basically a mantra that I've heard many times during my time with both BCG, but also with PwC. And it's a model, it's a simple model that applies not only to strategy, but also to operations and the execution of that strategy, right? So let me explain what this means. So by people, what we mean here is, well, who, what, when, why, and how are you going, or with what are you going to do certain things? Just the basics, right? Whose individual is going to do it? What do you want that person to do, to accomplish? By when? What are the incentives and what is going to drive that person to actually accomplish the mission or deliver on the mandate? And lastly, what are the limits of that, right? What are the resources that person gets, the guardrails? So very simple stuff. All of you, we don't need to talk about this a lot. This is obvious. Then the process is the how. How am I doing it? The recipe, the instructions, a set of steps to get somewhere, right? And then how am I doing? So that is what is the feedback that I'm getting on whether I'm following the instructions properly. If I'm following the recipe, what are some of those performance metrics? Just like in a car, you would get the gas gauge and the feedback from your dashboard. And lastly, you have tools. And tools is basically, well, how can I do this faster, better, easier, cheaper, or how can we scale this, right? So again, very simple stuff. No breakthrough here. With that being said, these very, very few people actually get this model. And I've seen people in early stage companies don't actually follow or use this mental model adequately when solving a particular problem, whether it's related to strategy, go-to-market strategy, or operations. And why is that? There's a lot of nuance. Frankly, when I learned this and when I heard it for the first time at PwC, it made sense, but I didn't get it. It took me years to actually internalize this mental model and use it effectively. And why is that? Well, there's nuance to it. A lot of nuance in every step of the way. The order matters. That's the first nuance. It's first people, then process, then tools. And you should not get into the next one without actually figuring out a clear and effective answer for the first one. And we'll talk. I'll get into some examples on how that might cause problems. So order matters. The other thing is some people do it in parallel. They try to solve for these three different things at the same time, and that doesn't work. So there's a lot of nuance in how you implement this model, and a lot of people don't get it right. So that's what I wanted to talk about this. I think it has broad applicability for large, small companies, and if used properly, it could troubleshoot many of the problems. I use it all the time to troubleshoot, and as a consultant, but also as an operator. And this is something that I also teach junior staff in the consulting business, and it's something that they have found useful. One last thing, and I'll get into this, and I want to make the case for something that I call the technology-less pilot or testing. And I'll explain what that means. It's based on this framework, and it's a pragmatic application of this framework to product design and to strategy. So I'll get into that once we start talking about the cases. So why don't we do that?
I have a question.
Yes.
Before you go into the case studies. So people process tools. Do you have any thoughts on the people one? One thing I hear a lot with our clients, and we don't even work with our clients on the in their kind of their people challenges as far as like hiring and engagement and things like that. Right. But being the nature of them just being clients, and we're talking about general things that they're winning in and things that they're having problems in. Team retention I feel like is a common thing that's coming up. And actually, Megan, who's on this call, we were talking about it the other day. Like maybe it's a generational thing of, people are jumping career to career to career a lot more. But I don't know if you see different ways of like, and it seems like at a bigger company, maybe retention might be easier because there's more career paths.
Right.
But do you have any thoughts on, what smaller companies can learn from larger companies as far as like retention and engagement, or specific any strategies there for, keeping team members for multiple years and making it really a career home as opposed to just a stop along the way?
Absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of as we think through this model, right, through the lens of this, retention is a key factor to succeed. If you don't get retention, doesn't matter, process, doesn't matter, the tools that you have, obviously, right? There's obviously limitations and differences in resources that small companies have versus large ones. And we can have a completely additional session to this one to talk about it, but and happy to follow up offline. But one of the biggest ways is designing for people who are not going to stay their entire career with your company, right? That might have a stint with the company, and designing for that, right? Such as companies like investment banks or consulting do, right? They are designed, and they expect that a lot of people are going to leave. Now, they are not great analogs for the early stage startup, but what applies is that you can have a model that thinks about, how do I manage the knowledge and information from people? How do I make sure that I don't lose all of the information and the tribe of knowledge once people start rotating, right? So that's one thing. And also plan for transitions. Instead of being reactive and having people quit on you, how can you plan ahead of that? And how can you get people to be confident and have openness to speak about it? I think those two things are applicable, but again, that's a completely separate conversation that is going to take us another session. If anyone is interested, by the way, including you, Luke, to talk about this topic, please feel free to reach out. I'd be more than happy to talk about it. I have thoughts on the topic. So, anyways, going back to this model of people, process, tools. One analogy that I like to use, and I like to use a lot of analogies when I teach staff about this framework, is you've probably seen this show on Netflix. I don't know. My wife and my daughter, they love it. It's called Nailed It. It's basically, if you haven't watched it, it's basically a show in which they get three. It's a bake-off competition. They get three amateur bakers, people that have done it probably in their kitchens a few times, and they give them like a crazy task to prepare a very fancy looking cake, right? That can take all these different shapes and forms. And the one that wins gets $10,000. All right. Now, the reason that show is pretty fun is because they end up creating these monstrosities when you compare them to the actual goal, right? The professionally prepared cake. And look, the reason that this model applies is the amateur bakers, when you think about this model, the tools are there 100%. They get a very nice kitchen with all the tools that you can imagine. The people component is somewhat there. The reason I'm saying that is they don't have the talent, clearly, and that's probably part of the challenge, but they have the motivation and the incentives, no question about it. And the goal is crystal clear. They get a picture, and the cake is actually there with them all the time. So they see clearly what is it that they are shooting for. You can see the power of incentives and clear goals, even when you lack enough talent, in how people get creative in getting to this, to preparing something that resembles the cake. So the other thing that they lack is process. They don't get, I think they get a recipe, but a very basic one, doesn't go into a lot of detail. So process is so. But anyways, the reason I'm saying this is what I have observed in my experience is people tend to over-index in tools and estimate the impact of people. And that's the case in the following example. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples here. This is the first one. And this is a situation in which they did not follow the framework, people, process, tools. They went directly to the tool. And it failed miserably. In fact, they probably did a little process, but they completely skipped the people part. What happened is with this company, small company, they implemented a CRM and spent the time, and then obviously just the cost of the CRM, and expecting that would create more discipline and would force a process on the people. So thinking about, well, my CRM, once I implement that, process and people are going to fall into place. That was the expectation, right? Not that people thought, well, the CRM is a silver bullet. Obviously, the people that led this company are not naive in that way. But the thing is, once they implemented this, no one used the CRM was the situation, And why is it that they didn't use it? Well, first they thought, look, we need to do some training and start people asking to input things into the CRM. They did that, still had the same problem. The reason was going back to people really didn't have the incentive in the first place to use the CRM. And forget about the CRM. The CRM is ultimately the tool. Why do we even think about the CRM? Well, they wanted to increase sales. But they were failing to do so because people were not incentivized. They didn't have a clear task of achieving the sales. They did not have the skills either, or the talent to do it. So the people aspect was completely missed. Why? Like, are people in this company stupid? No. The situation is when you're going so quickly, and this is something. So these two things happen a lot to early stage startups. One is you're moving so fast, so quickly, that sometimes you take shortcuts, deliberately, or most of the times not deliberately, and that creates problems, like in this case. The other aspect is tech startups. People are so passionate about technology, not just their technology, but in general, that they tend to over-index on the tool part of things. They just get excited about a new gadget or a new tool, and they want to run with it and implement that and have it for their business. And the problem is that causes a lot of waste of time, money. The way you would do this instead is you start by, oh, sorry, did I lose you? Can you still hear me?
Yep, I still hear you.
Thank you.
You're still there.
So the way you do this is you start by defining, well, what is it that I want people to accomplish, right? Which is obviously I want to increase sales, and then you give that task to a set of people that ideally are prepared to do it. And if they are not prepared, you prepare them, and you spend time in creating that skill set, right? And then you make sure that people have the incentives and the why about doing it, either a commission or something else. That's, sales 101. I'm not talking about anything. I mean, look, you could give a training on this. I'm not talking about anything, crazy, right? So that's the process. And then, that's the single most important thing. Getting the people component right is maybe 70-80% of the battle. Then, process, and lastly, tools. The reason I'm saying it's about 80-70% of the battle is even when you get the process component, you can get it wrong. If people have the right incentives, if people have the right talent, they can figure it out. So having a process makes things better, but having people at a bare minimum puts you on a path to potential success. Whereas if you don't have people, you have process, you have tools, then it's much harder to accomplish the goal, right? So that's the first part. And I said I was going to talk about something that I called the technology-less pilot. What that means is you basically, people, when they think about pilots, especially with early stage startups and software startups, when they think about a pilot, they think about piloting the actual product, the actual technology. That's important. However, there are certain elements, precisely the people and the process components, that many times can be tested separately. How? Well, for example, in this particular situation, we could have, instead of spending time selecting and implementing a CRM and paying that money, we could have started just using a simple process with a couple of people. And actually we did. I worked with one individual, and we set up a process with an Excel spreadsheet or an Airtable module in which we started tracking their progress. And we gave that person the incentives. We made sure that person was the right fit. And it worked beautifully. We actually accomplished many more outreach meetings, proposals with that individual than what we had achieved when we implemented the CRM for everyone. So that's the example here of how to implement a technology-less pilot. Can you move to the next slide, to example number 2, please? I'm having a hard time doing it myself. Sorry.
There we go.
Thank you. So in terms of the second case here, and this is a different type of challenge, which is related to a product design. So we did a product design for a within a corporate setting, right? But it was pretty much a completely new venture. And the problem we faced is, in this particular case, different from the previous one, we did all three phases. I was part of that project. I was leading it. So this is a lesson that I learned. We went through the people component very thoroughly, defined incentives, found the people, thought about training, etc. Right? Made sure that the task was very clear. We created a process, guides, support for people to reach out, and then we created the tool. The problem was that the people component was flawed. Even though we spent a lot of time, not that we neglected it, not at all. The problem was that we designed incorrectly, and that happens all the time. Now, this is a situation. Because of this, we had to start from scratch, and that just turned into a waste of something around 6 months. So instead of doing that, what you do is with a technology-less pilot, we could have tested the people and process component first. We could have, faked, if you will, some of the automations that the tool was going to deliver, such as reports, such as notifications for individuals. So we could have done that without spending the 3 months that it took us to build the tool and then test it and then roll it out. And we would have learned a lot of different things in a much faster way. Matter of fact, we did that afterwards. We started doing things outside of the tool manually. We tested the processes. We tested the incentives. And once they work, then you move into the tool component. So those are the two examples and clear applications that I've had with the people, process, and tool model, and this concept of the technology-less or limited technology pilot. And I don't know if we have any other questions or if we have time for more questions, Luke.
No, that's awesome. And we unfortunately don't, but the last 30 seconds, I'll just say my takeaways. I love that people process tools. I love that framework. I think it's important to remember. I think it's tempting to try to skip steps, but starting with people, having empathy for each individual situation, trying to understand that, and then slowly moving. So I love that it's that waterfall. And if you do get impatient, I like what you kind of just said of like, what can you almost imitate down the line without going like fully invested. And then I think the other thing that I liked was just being kind of loose-handed with it and planning for change, knowing that all three of those will be changing over the years. And probably in the reverse order, like tools will probably have a lot of turnover, process will get broken every time you grow. And then if you can plan for change on the people side, but try as hard as you can to not have as much change there. Those are some of my takeaways. So Carlo, thank you for leading us in this. And then that last slide, I don't know if Carlo or you or Megan is in charge of it, but if you go to the very last slide, if anybody wants to follow up with Carlo, my email is right there, Luke at myserendipitysales.com. We're available. Connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to stay in touch. So Carlo, I don't know if you have any closing remarks.
No, I would be happy to talk more about this. It's a topic that I enjoy discussing, and please reach out if you want to just have a conversation and use me as a sounding board. I'd be happy to do it.
Awesome. Thanks, Carlo. Hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.